Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Leaders Talk, which is a series of seminars organized by the School of Advanced Studies on Culture, Politics, and Democracy of University of Rome Unitel Sapienza, in which we host different international experts on different themes. And today with us, we have the pleasure to have Professor Lucas Lixinski. I hope I pronounced that well, which is professor and associate dean at the Faculty of Law and Justice at University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. His main fields of study include cultural heritage, gender and sexuality, international law, and Latin American politics and law. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So far, so good.
He's now a visiting professor at our Department of Law and Digital Society here at University of Rome Unitel Sapienza. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today. My first question for you today would be, we often think of Indigenous peoples in terms of their specificity in their cultures. What is the added value of comparative law in this field?
Right. Thank you for having me, by the way. It's very exciting to be able to talk to all of you and to you specifically about these issues. So the issue of cultural specificity is really fascinating when it comes to Indigenous peoples, right? Because if you think of the issue from a legal anthropology sort of perspective, then it's all about the granularity of the culture, right? This culture is very narrow. It doesn't exist anywhere else, and it is special in its own terms. And that is wonderful, but also the law kind of requires a level of abstraction because we need to have generalized or generally applicable kind of solutions, right? So in a way that there's kind of a tension here. And it's also important to bear in mind that for Indigenous peoples, they need coalition building, right? And comparative law allows you to do that. Because for the most part, in most countries around the world, Indigenous peoples, they kind of need to exist within a nation state, but the nation state doesn't usually treat them as well as they would like to be treated in the law. So to be able to rely on the experiences of other Indigenous peoples, so to build coalition with them, gives you platforms and pathways for advocacy. And that's why comparative law is so important, right? Because it enables that kind of conversation.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting what you said. And this also, I think, applies to other types of minorities within the nation state. It's not just an Indigenous people's struggle. Would it make sense to make like a comparative approach, to have a comparative approach also in regard to other minorities?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of shared characteristics, right, between Indigenous peoples and other historically disadvantaged groups, particularly, yes, minorities in almost like an European sort of sense, German speakers in Tyrol or Bretons in France and what have you, but also then with Afro-descendants, particularly in Latin America, and even peasant communities, right, which is a relatively new phenomenon. And there's a lot of coalition that you can grow also across these different identities, not just a minority with a minority, but also, let's say, a minority with an Afro-descendant group. So even though they're all, as a matter of law, slightly different categories. In some countries, they're equivalent, but not necessarily. There's still a lot to be learned. And that's something that I've been working with an Afro-descendant leader from Ecuador, Jonathan Sanchez, on this topic. And we've kind of landed on this term of tactical intersectionality, right? So it's the acknowledgement that when it comes to pathways for legal advocacy, even though Indigenous peoples may not want to mix, quote unquote, with minorities or local communities more broadly or Afro-descendants, as a matter of fact, they actually do benefit from legal gains by these other groups, right? So one example in international law is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is one of the major human rights treaties out there. It has this provision called Article 27, which is on the rights of persons belonging to cultural, linguistic, or religious minorities, which is a provision on minority rights. But the biggest successes in using that provision actually come from Indigenous peoples.
This is very, very interesting. And I think this links to one of my other questions for you, which is culture is usually perceived in two ways, approached in two ways, as a right in itself, and more lately, recently, it has become growing, this approach, or as a pathway to other rights. And I think this latter approach is the more shared and the more defined. What insights does comparative law yield about the relationship between indigenous rights and culture in this sense?
Right. So in general, the relationship between culture and indigenous rights is sort of fascinating, right? Because we tend to define indigenous peoples as a group that has a distinctive culture, right? There's no agreed definition of indigenous peoples in international law, but there is a sense of a distinctive culture as one key element. Other elements are self-identification as an indigenous person and acceptance by an indigenous group as an indigenous person when we're drilling down to this sort of the individual level. But culture is always something that is there, right? And because culture is so essential, we tend to think of having a version of culture that is distinctive from mainstream society as a precondition for access to any kind of rights. And that is wonderful in many ways because it gives you as an indigenous person something very clear around which to organize, right? We all share this culture, therefore let's go out and defend it. And that's the right to culture. But then culture as a precondition to rights can also kind of have adverse effects, such as, it's the trap that scholars like Arturo Escobar will describe as the trap of ethno-development, right? That indigenous peoples, they can have rights to land, they can have rights of access to all sorts of pathways to develop themselves, but only if it happens in an ethnically appropriate sort of way, which in an indigenous sense usually means kind of a traditional quote-unquote way of life, which is always validated by an outsider, right? And that's really problematic as well. That even though it's about self-identification, whether you are indigenous or not, at the end of the day, it needs to be validated by a white person who really has no idea about what your culture is. They have an expectation of what an indigenous person might look like and might want, and that's what ends up kind of prevailing. And ethno-development can be really complicated, and comparative law can help us realize these shortcomings by, for instance, looking at cases in Canada where people have tried to attack the rights of indigenous peoples to the fishing in their traditional grounds on the basis that they were using nylon nets as opposed to traditional nets, and therefore those rights should be extinguished. Likewise, in Australia, people have tried to attack native title by indigenous peoples in Australia, so the right to land, on the basis that they had electricity and refrigerators and televisions, and that was not a traditional way of living. So again, it boils down to coalition building and all of that, but it's also understanding those limits of culture and ethno development. But on the other extreme, there are countries where culture can almost enhance the rights that are available, right? So an example is in Brazil, not with indigenous peoples, but with Afro-descendant populations, in which their right to culture, to their cultural heritage, potentialized or kind of leveled up their right to land to the point where they had right not only to the land that was already state land and therefore quote unquote publicly available, but even it meant that they had a stronger title than someone who did not have a cultural connection to land, like a private party. So cultural heritage and cultural rights in a sense serve to kind of create an avenue to expropriate private lands in favor of an Afro-descendant population.
Yeah, no, I was thinking when you said that the indigenous people's culture is seen as something rather closed and well defined and crystallized and very minoritarian in a nation state. This I feel like creates and is caused and creates and perpetuates a dichotomy that it's not present, I feel, in real life, because culture is very there's osmosis between
Yes.
groups. There's a great mobility of ideas, of concepts, of structures, but this, I think, and correct me, of course, I'm not a law expert, but comes from the need in law, in policy making also, to have clear and precise definitions.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Absolutely, right? So the law has this little problem that it can be a wonderful language of power, but it needs to define that which is regulating, right? And when it comes to culture, it tends to then kind of define culture in almost in a very static sort of way, which is why in a cultural heritage sort of context, the law usually has a hard time with intangible cultural heritage because it's a form of culture that is by definition ever evolving and ever changing. So we tend to default in countries like Australia, where I'm based normally, to intellectual property as a key mechanism to safeguard culture, because it's the only way we can actually really understand it. But of course, then once it's in intellectual property, especially common law, copyright law, it's the way that the culture has been fixated, and any deviation from that, either if it's a sufficient degree, it's a different thing altogether, and therefore the community cannot make a claim to it, or any small deviation, even at the hands of the community, can be an infringement, which is mind-boggling, right? This idea that culture needs to be frozen in time for the duration of the term of protection by intellectual property law.
Yeah, and this is, I think, also a consequence of lack of adequate representation in the policymaking process, and also in international like settings and international instruments and bodies are all nation state driven. And when you have a nation state that dictates in a way what culture is for its like ecosystem, cultural ecosystem, and there is no adequate mobility of ideas, there cannot be like a holistic approach to culture and cultural heritage, I think, legislation.
Exactly, but that's even when so that's kind of the almost the extreme bad situation, right? It's the state trying to preserve national culture and kind of quashing everything that deviates from that idea. But even on a well-meaning sort of side, right, it still can become paternalistic so quickly. And one example is like really well-meaning anthropologists and archaeologists who can act as a bridge between an indigenous culture and the legislator. But at the end of the day, well-meaning as they are, they get to speak on behalf of an indigenous population, kind of pushing their view of what an indigenous person is and wants onto others and having that become law. And no matter how well-meaning they are, there's something that's always going to be there, however subconsciously, that will preserve the need for an archaeologist and an anthropologist above all else.
Let's all read Orientalism by Edward Said in this
regard.
No, because I'm now studying the intersection between AI and so digital transition and digital empowerment, and the implication that these can have on indigenous peoples and in minorities in general, which don't have maybe the digital literacy or maybe don't like perceive their culture and their mental structures in the technological frameworks and frames that are now deeply ingrained in modern technology. So this is why I don't know if you have some example in this regard that you were willing to share. But
data sovereignty is a massive issue for indigenous peoples, right, around the world. Partly because, yes, a lot of indigenous peoples cannot really access that data to even try to control it in the first place, because we still have a major gap in access to to technology. But even if you do, there's always the question of that paternalistic treatment of indigenous peoples as a source or a data point rather than the owner of their own information, right? And of course, it's something that wasn't invented in relation to indigenous peoples. It's a much broader complication in terms of also generally race and gender and all sorts of what in the law we would call protected characteristics, right? It cuts across the board, but it almost boils down to this constant need to realize that there's a baseline, which is a white, Western, cisgender, property-owning male, right? And anything that and able-bodied, and anything that deviates from that kind of needs to justify itself against the world, and always starting from subordinate or subaltern kind of position.
Yeah. No, this is very, very interesting. But I want to make a step back, maybe.
Back to indigenous peoples?
Back
Sure.
to indigenous peoples and land rights. Because there are major issues that it's like transversale?
Cut across?
Cut
or
across,
yeah.
yeah.
A cross-cutting sort of issue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because is it like this problematic relationship? Is it like this in all jurisdiction, or are there some like good practices or?
Oof. Yes, it is a cross-cutting issue, right? Indigenous peoples across the globe, they usually make claims for land rights as one of their first things, because self-determination, at least as far as statehood is concerned, is largely off the table around the world. So the next thing is, okay, let's at least control our land. So it's almost a private law surrogate or replacement for what you cannot do as a matter of statehood. If I cannot control my territory to become my own state, let me at least control my territory as a matter of land rights. So that is very much a key part of the conversation for most indigenous peoples, but there is a lot of variation around the globe, right? So there's that example I already mentioned of Afro-descendant land rights in Brazil. Brazil likewise has a constitutional recognition framework for indigenous land rights, which works very similarly. And in countries like Brazil and across Latin America, the assumption is that indigenous peoples, when they can make a claim for a successful claim for land rights, which requires, proof of historic occupation and endorsement by an anthropologist. And in countries like Australia, which has a similar system, indigenous peoples actually, they have started Aboriginal archaeological associations because the proof of archaeological remnants or the existence of archaeological remnants helps prove traditional occupation of the land, right? So rock art in particular. So all of that kind of builds into then land title, which is collective and non-alienable, which is wonderful in many respects, because it almost embodies this idea of sovereignty that we were talking about earlier. But then it kind of becomes a bit of a trap, again, that ethno-development sort of trap, because if you have non-alienable title, it means you cannot use it for credit. So all of a sudden you have all this land, but you cannot access the capital to help you develop and work and cultivate that land, right? But then on the other extreme, you have indigenous populations in Africa, which do receive individual and alienable title, which allows them to access credit, but then for a host of reasons, many of which are tied to systemic discrimination, but not all of them. A lot of these people end up then losing the title to their lands to banks, and that leads to massive land grabbing in Africa, usually in favor of foreign states like China, that has been buying a lot of land in Africa, all across Africa. And that doesn't fix the problem either, right? So it's a question of what's the acceptable line of paternalism or taking this option off the table for indigenous peoples? Because in Latin America, this World Bank economist, Hernando de Soto, famously talked about, liberating the economic potential of land for indigenous peoples by giving them individual title and therefore access to credit. But in the African experience, you actually have a lot of people in Africa saying, please make our title collective and inalienable because we're being exploited to no end. So the whichever solution you go with, right, there's no total fix. And what then comparative law teaches us, and what the comparative analysis of these two examples across the Atlantic show us, is that maybe the real problem lies elsewhere. It's not property law as a category. It's maybe a problem that is even outside of the law, right? It's the economic system that allows for exploitation, whether it is exploitation by an opt-out of the market that kind of only reinforces economic subjugation by trapping you into ethno development, or exploitation by, a lot of those same factors playing out to eventually take the title away from you, which is what happens in Africa.
So basically, there's this never-ending tension
Yes.
that we obviously cannot resolve here and today. But of course, I will ask you a lot of more questions also in your office hours and forever and ever, because these topics are very, very interesting and very dear to me right now as my field of research. But I think our time is up today for now. So thank you very much, Professor Lucas Lixinski, for being with us today and for his valuable and very interesting insights. And until next Leaders Talk, goodbye everyone and take care.
Thank you.